Hello, it's Lawrence Romanosky from Calgary, Canada, and we are in the middle of a very cold winter. I think I don't think we've had a day above -15 for like 20 days. It's 20 below, so I'll probably make this one short. This is what we're looking at here is a Mercedes Benz 300sel 6.3 that's in a little bit of a sorry state, and it came by here, and I was just talking to the owner of the car and maybe figuring out what to do with it. And but it's a very interesting car, and it would look almost exactly like any other Mercedes 108 or 109 from the late 60s or early 70s. And if it didn't have this badge on the back that says 6.3, you'd think it would be absolutely nothing special and worth a few $1,000s. However, if somebody opened the hood and you had a look at it, well, you'd see this massive lump of an engine in there. That's an M100 engine, 6.3 liters. It's from the 600 series of Mercedes limousines, and the head, or not actually, he became the head of passenger car engineering. Dr. Waxenberger in period decided it would be a great idea to put the giant 6.3 liter engine in this car. It was never designed for a V8, but it fit anyway, and he would have showed it to Uhlenhout, who was then the director for engineering, and of course the famous Mercedes Benz figure responsible for many of the famous Grand Prix cars. Anyway, so this is the first, well, we can call this the first example of an S-Class. This car would have had, when it was a 300sel, it would have had a straight 6 in it, mechanically fuel injected 6. And then this car's air suspension, W108s had steel suspension, W109s had air suspension. This car, Road and Track claimed as nearly the greatest car in the world. They had the road test, I recall, they had this car beating a Corvette at the drag strip. So the engine was rated for 250 horsepower in the 600 car, and it's rated for 250 horsepower in this car. But the 600 would have had an extra alternator. It had 2 alternators. It also had a big hydraulic pump that they claimed, all in all, took 50 horsepower to run. So I think that most people agree this engine's underrated. Even a 600 Pullman would go 0 to 60 in 11 seconds. This car, depending on who tested it and when, you can see figures of anywhere between high 5s or mid 6s. These cars were they made a relatively large number, 6,500. Compare that to the W111 3.5 coupes and cabriolets, the really collectible Mercedes from this era. They made around 1,200 of both the coupe and the, combined, of the coupe and the cabriolet. So this one at 6,500 is relatively, more common. It was expensive to restore. Certainly the engine's very complicated. The interior used the very best woods and leathers in the day. So of course, if you have to restore that now, it's expensive. The bodies were very susceptible to rust. Okay. And the air suspension as well. Now, just to describe that, the layout is very similar to the steel-sprung cars. The difference in the air suspension, which was in the 300sel 6.3, and this car, is that it doesn't sit on a coil spring anymore. It looks like more like a steel cone with like a rubber donut on top of it, and the donut then can inflate or deflate, and this affects the ride level. So there is an air pump, and you can see that on the front of the engine. It pumps air to an oil reservoir. There is then, which is kept under pressure, then there's a series of mechanical valves and regulators on each of the suspension components. So the air comes in, it gets compressed, it goes into the reservoir, it then gets distributed throughout the 4 suspension points, and these little rubber donuts then inflate and deflate and keep the ride level steady. Now, of course, after 50 years, none of this is going to work. All the valves will seize up. All of the the air suspension will leak. The air compressor will not compress. The reservoir will leak. So all that stuff needs to be gone through. Maybe it's good for 20 years or so before you start having problems. And certainly you need somebody who knows what they're doing to work on it. You also, with this M100 engine, it would be fundamentally similar to the 3.5 liter engine, which became the 117 engine, which is in the variations of that were in all the 80s Mercedes up until 1991. The fundamental design would be similar, although this is entirely mechanically fuel injection, not the CIS, and then there's no parts in common. So you don't want to take it to your Mercedes dealer and have the tech learn how to work on an M100 engine at $140 an hour. So as a result, these cars, the body shells rusted, the interiors wore out, the suspension collapsed, and the engine needed work, but they weren't really worth that much money. Okay, they have always, until recently, they've always sat around the $25,000 range, maybe, if that. And so when people restored them, they didn't feel they had the budget to really do a lot of things properly. And what you get now is you get cars that have been restored once or 2 times, and you need to figure out who's been in there before you and what they've done. And then now that the cars are kind of worth something, what you have to do to go back and fix everything that people didn't do right in the first place. Now in some cars, the body is really far and away the most important thing to look at, and all the mechanical stuff is really secondary, and the interior is secondary. But with some of these cars, the body is probably still the most important thing, but the mechanical condition or the interior shouldn't be overlooked either. It's all expensive to fix. So let's look at the body. This one isn't too bad. A rusty 60s or 70s Mercedes can be truly awful, but you can see some bubbling happening on the arches. You can see the Bondo there, which is now cracking and flaking off. And you can probably presume that when you take off these aftermarket chrome fender extensions or trim pieces, that you're going to find some corrosion under there. With any old Mercedes, you want to look in the trunk wells, and actually it looks pretty good. I mean, I'm not sure what's been, I assume that it's been been worked on in there, but there's no obvious signs that it's really bad at all, so it looks actually decent. And the same on this side. This will all be completely rusted out on a bad car, meaning that you need major surgery. Okay, so also these cars will rust at the top of the lights. Often you can see a little bit of bubbling, right on top of the light there, but then you take the light out and it's just all rusted. So this one actually looks not bad. Mechanically, the engine is an unknown quantity right now because we haven't got it running. So we actually just don't know what that is going to be like. The interior of the car was redone, but instead of the really high quality German leather that would have been in this top of the line car, we have some vinyl interior, which they did an okay job on it. It looks fine, but it's not right. And then we do have some damage in the wood. So the weather strip, or the window seal, then will dry out. It'll crack, water will get in, it'll flow down to the base of the windscreen, and it'll take out all the wood trim. So you can see it's delaminating over there as well, and it's faded in other places. Okay, so a little bit of damage to the headliner, and the rear bench, of course, is vinyl. So it, the wood needs to come out and be redone, and the seats need to be redone. If I look underneath the carpet, I actually get the original insulation, and you can see the floorboards, which actually look okay. So it's got some good things going for it. There would normally be a height adjustment for the air suspension. It's been taken out because the air suspension has been taken out. Now the suspension would be similar to the coils, to the steel sprung one, so they would have just retrofitted back to the 108 steel suspension. They did leave the air compressor in the car, but you don't know what else has been taken out, and no original parts. So okay, so what have you got? I wish they just left it alone with the original leather interior, because now you have to redo that. Engine's an unknown quantity. You have to decide whether you want to get back to the air suspension or just keep it the way it is. The chrome 14-inch alloys and the fender extensions or trim bits don't do the car any favors. So what have you got here? You would need to take the interior out, retrim the seats, redo the wood, probably take it back down to bare metal, take off the fender trim bits, address all the corrosion, sort all that out, figure out what's missing for the suspension, revert it back to the proper air suspension, find the parts, get the engine going, figure out what it needs, and that sounds like a couple big unknowns. Sounds like a $50,000 bill to me, or more. It sounds like 50 grand. And then there's a big unknown with the engine. The engine could probably be 20 alone. So it's a car with questions. Of course, there's more cars like this probably than restored ones. And you know, when you buy a car like this, you know, it may not be much different than getting something that is just completely, that needs everything. And so you need to go in with your eyes wide open. Happily, it's worth saving, you know, because the best cars now are really worth some money. And this is, you know, this is a great piece of Mercedes history. This is the first kind of hot rod, you know, or European hot rod anyway, from Mercedes. I suppose there's ones before, but you know, at least post-war, where you have a mid-sized sedan and a big engine in it. It was a really kind of groundbreaking and pivotal car. This was a version of this car would have been the start for AMG. They would have raced this car in Spa. You know, they actually raced it, so it's worth saving. It's a great car. It needs somebody to give it some love and to, you know, bring it back the way it should be. Put the right suspension, the right interior, sort out the you know, the engine, and bring it back to what it should be. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a chore to look through this video. It is 20 below. I'm sorry if I'm a little shaky with the camera, but it's a really interesting car. I didn't want to let it go without getting some footage of it. Thank you very much, Lawrence Romanosky from Calgary, Canada.